Welcome to the Counselling Tutor podcast, the must-listen-to podcast for students of counselling and psychotherapy. Here are your hosts, Rory Lees Oakes and Ken Kelly.
Hello and welcome to the Counselor Tutor podcast with me, Rory Lees Oakes, and as always, my good friend and partner in everything therapeutic, Mr. Ken Kelly. How are you doing, Ken?
I am delighted to be here, and we're on episode 10. It's the Deca episode. Is that the right way of saying it? Deca episode.
Deca. What's Deca episode?
Yeah, I thought it was Latin or something for 10. Deca.
Deca. I don't know. I'll have to get my Latin book out.
Yeah, I don't know. Deca just feels like a 10. It just feels like a milestone hitting 10. And we've had just such fantastic feedback from you, our listeners, and we're so very, very grateful. It seems like you're finding some of our stuff useful, and we're just glad to be here for you. And we've got lots more to look forward to in this episode because Rory is going to be in a moment dipping into REBT. We'll get to that in a moment. In skills today, we're going to be looking at endings. And you may be surprised when you have a listen to that because it's not just the ending of a session. There's a few endings that might be kind of sneak endings that will pop in there as well. And then we're going to be ending off by looking at culture versus ethics, and culture actually trumps ethics. We'll get to that in a moment. But first, I want to bat over to you, Rory, because you're going to be bringing some REBT to us today in Theory with Rory.
Absolutely, Ken. And I'm going to be talking about the work of Albert Ellis, a New York-based psychologist. For those of you who have never met him, he is the father, really, of CBT, of cognitive behavioural therapy.
Yeah.
He developed his own therapy called Rational Emotive Therapy, and then he popped behaviour in there, I think, as a bit of added value at some point. I think it was the 80s they added the beard. It used to be called REBT therapy. And I think the CBT people may have been taking his ground a bit, so he stuck in behaviour there. And he ran the Albert Ellis Institute in New York. He lived over there, and they still do. If you go to New York, Ken, get this, you can still have $5 Friday night REBT.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah, if you go to New York and I think you have to book it nowadays. If you go over to New York, you can watch REBT therapy being practiced for $5, and they're a super helpful organisation as well. I wrote a question. One of my students asked a question that I couldn't answer, so I wrote to the Ellis Institute a few years ago, and I received by return a lovely email from a PhD researcher over there who just gave me the answer I wanted. So fantastic. And I'm going to be talking a little bit about behavioural therapy, why it's useful, and I'm going to give you a specific event that happened in my life. I observed a minor car accident and how I applied a little bit of REBT to one of the participants in the accident as I was on my way to get my lunch. Ken.
My goodness me. So without any further ado, let's get the ABCDEs of REBT. See what I did there, Rory?
I see what you did there, Ken.
Counselling Theory with Rory Lees Oakes.
A few years ago, while working as a support worker in Manchester, I decided to pop out for some lunch and walk into town. It was on that journey that I witnessed a car accident. Someone had pulled out of a lay-by and collided with a car that had the right of way. Thankfully, no one was hurt, and both the drivers were exchanging details and talking to each other. What was noticeable was the two drivers had different views on the same event. The driver that we'll call the victim of the crash, who was making their way down the road, took a very circumspect view of things. No one was hurt, the car had minor scratches, and that they would get on their way and the insurance company be in touch. However, contrast this with the driver that had pulled out. The view of that driver was, I'm a useless driver, the car's a write-off, and I'll never drive again. Eventually, the driver who was the victim of the crash drove off, leaving the driver who'd pulled out at the side of the road, looking a bit forlorn. So I started a conversation. I asked if they were all right, and the reply was yes, but the car's a write-off. I said, where's your evidence the car's a write-off? It looks a little bit like panel damage and a few scratches. Does everything work okay? Does it start up? The response came, well, yes. I'm a rubbish driver, was the next response, to which I responded, well, how many accidents have you had? The response came back, well, this is the first one. And how many miles have you driven? Well, lots. So where's your evidence that you're a rubbish driver? The third response, which was equally as interesting, was, I'll never drive again. I pointed out that this was, a possible scenario. However, how are you going to get home? After a few seconds, the driver said, maybe I'll drive, and got in the car and drove off. What I experienced was examples of automatic negative thoughts, and they're sometimes called ants. Sometimes in stressful occasions, we generate very negative thoughts, or sometimes we just generate them in general. And I'm going to give you an example of ants or automatic negative thoughts. I'm going to give you a few examples here. The first is overgeneralization. Does this sound familiar? Where somebody says, always, this always happens. Someone misses a train or a plane. This always happens. Always the same. Every time I try and get on a plane, it's always late. Overgeneralization. Sometimes we have what we call selective abstraction or filtering, concentrating on the negatives. And I can give you an example of that. A few years ago, I did an appraisal with someone and told them how brilliantly they were doing. And all I got back was, yeah, but I'm rubbish at this and I'm rubbish at that and I'm absolutely hopeless at this. And that's sometimes called selective abstraction. It's focusing on the negatives. All or nothing thinking, where somebody believes that they made a mistake and it's literally the end of the world. And so all or nothing thinking may be a tendency to view things at the extremes. And I used to work with a colleague, and if anything went wrong, that was it. It was the end of the world. Nothing could repair it. It was totally destroyed. Whatever was being done could not be now completed. And sometimes personalising things, where people believed that things that were nothing to do with them was their fault. I've worked with a lot of people who say that must be my fault. If I hadn't have walked down the corridor and looked out the window, then the building wouldn't have burnt down. Another one is catastrophizing. Oh, I can't spell it. Catastrophizing. That's the word I'm looking for. Catastrophizing. Overestimating disaster. And we see that a lot sometimes. People who've got fear of flying, it might always going to happen. I know if I get on this plane, the plane's going to fall out of the sky. And finally, mind reading is a really good one. Making assumptions about people's thoughts, feelings and behaviours without checking the evidence. How many times have you heard someone, or maybe experienced it yourself, saying, oh, my boss is looking at me in a funny way, ergo, it's something I've done. Yeah, if that sounds familiar. Well, if any of these sounds familiar, they are actually automatic negative thoughts, or they're sometimes called ants. And, we all get them from time to time. It's part of being human. But it's when people work on those ideas all the time and it causes them trouble in their life that they may seek to go to therapy. So which therapy would they choose? Well, I think it's quite interesting. There's a lot of therapies about, but REBT, Rational Emotive Behavioural Therapy, was developed by Albert Ellis. Now, Albert Ellis was born in America, in New York, in 1913, and to all intents and purposes, he was a very shy person. And he decided one day he needed to get to know women when he was a younger man. So he decided he'd set his goal on speaking to 100 women in Central Park in America. And that's what he did. He wandered around Central Park talking to every woman he could meet to try and get over his shyness of women. And that led him, amongst other things, to develop a therapy called REBT, or Rational Emotive Behavioural Therapy. And it's the cousin of cognitive behavioural therapy. There's lots of similarities, although there are some differences. Now, REBT works on an alphabet called A, B, C, D, and E. So A is the activating event. So an activating event happens in someone's life. And B, a belief system is formed. So if we take the car accident, the activating event was, had a car crash. The belief was, the car will never drive again. I'm a rubbish driver and I'll never drive. Yep, so that's the belief system the person was working on. And C is the consequence, the emotional consequences of A and B. Well, the emotional consequences for the person who was struggling to drive after an accident was, I'll never drive again and my car's a write-off and I'll never be able to get home. So emotionally, quite sad, scared maybe, and upset. And what REBT therapists do is go for the B. They'll look for the belief system and try and offer a different form of belief. They won't talk about the activating event, but they'll go for the belief system and see if there's any other form of belief that someone could work on. So to do that, they may very well dispute irrational thoughts and beliefs, which is what I did with the person who had the car crash. I kind of said, where's your evidence the car's a write-off? Where's your evidence you're a rubbish driver? And I disputed, I guess, well, how are you going to get home? If you're not going to drive again, how are you going to get home? And it was quite interesting because, as the therapy would tell you, the E is the new revised belief. So when people have gone through REBT, which is really good for things like phobias or irrational thinking or automatic negative thoughts, the E is where they come to work through their new view of the world. So someone who says, oh, I don't know, I'm frightened of flying because planes crash. The therapist may very well say to them, well, hey, there are plane crashes, that clearly happens. But out of all the millions of flying hours, how many planes crash? And also, statistically, it's safer than driving. Did you drive here today? Well, there you go. Statistically, flying's safer than driving, and you got here okay. So it's about disputing the irrational thinking and also working with and trying to develop a new cognitive and emotional view on things. And in fact, Albert Ellis wrote a book called A Guide to Rational Living, and he called it The Semantics of Science and Word Meanings. And he believed that, unlike lower animals, people tell themselves various sane and crazy things. Their beliefs, attitudes and opinions and philosophies take the form of internalized sentences or self-talk. And one of the things that I've had to look at through the years is should, musts and have tos. And someone wrote a book on that called The Tyranny of Shoulds by Karen Horney, I think it was. And effectively, sometimes it's very easy to say, I must do that, I should do this, I ought to do that. And sometimes it's okay to say, I ain't going to do any of those things today, I'm going to just do something for me. So that's an overview of REBT. It sounds a very simple therapy, and I don't want to disrespect the therapy. It is a very straightforward therapy. It's not as complex as the more psychodynamic therapies that have theories of personality, or as complex, I guess, as, say, humanistic therapies that view a phenomenological outlook on the world and how people see it. It's plain and simply just asking people to consider their beliefs, and is there another explanation? Well, I hope you enjoyed this little segment on REBT. If you want to know more about it, go to the show notes page on www.counsellingtutor.com. Remember, that's one L in, 2 L's in counselling, not one. And I'll pop in a little bit of information about REBT, and also I'll put in the examples of automatic negative thoughts, and also I'll put in another irrational series of thoughts. So why don't you have a look at that and tell me what you think on the Facebook page.
I really enjoyed that, Rory, and I guess it's about challenging the belief at the end of the day. What more can we do?
What more can we do, indeed? And yes, and I don't think I managed to get my sandwich either, which no, I didn't. I used so much time up, I had to go back to the hostel I worked at. But I got a great story out of it, Ken. So hey, and I've dined out on that so many times. So I'm happy not to have a lunch on that occasion. So I think we'll end that there, Ken. Did you see what I did there, Ken?
I did.
End that there.
I did.
So you did. So what are you going to be looking at in Skills with Ken today?
Well, we're going to be looking at endings, and that may be how to end a session when you see that a client is coming to the end, but it must also be unplanned endings when a client just doesn't come back and you're left there waiting for the client, and how that feels for you. Might be endings around when we go on holiday and how we plan that with the client. So all things endings, Rory.
Counselling Skills with Ken Kelly.
Endings in counselling, endings in therapy can be tricky. And I want to start this off with an exercise. I want you to have a think in your mind for me. And I want you to think about a time when you in your life experienced a sudden and unexpected ending. Have a think. It may have been a sad loss, a death of a loved one, a pet. It may be the loss of a job that you haven't experienced, where you walked into work one day and they said, that's it, you can't work here anymore. It could be a relationship that you were in. I guess we all have an ending that we can look to. And when you look to that ending, have a think and see how that feels for you. What kind of emotions are still with you from that unexpected ending that kind of came at you? It's almost a feeling of helplessness, and it's amazing that the emotions surrounded with that ending can be with us for some time after the actual ending itself. Then I want to take you on a different path, and I want to ask you to imagine a time when you felt something was drawing on and on and on, and you just wish that this would end for you. And again, examples here, it might be a relationship that you were in that you were unhappy in, and you didn't feel that you could say, you know what, this is not working for me, and you were staying in there just hoping something would change, and it was just carrying on. It could be a job that you hated for years, that you were staying in and just wishing that you were out of it, but you felt trapped in it. How about those visitors, the visitors that won't leave, that they don't get the hints when you're kind of saying, well, look at the time, and we have to be up early in the morning, and they're going, ha, 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 and they just carry on, and they will not go. Have a think about how that felt for you. Now, we're going to be taking those thoughts, those feelings, those emotions that sit with endings and relating them to how that fits in with our counselling, with our therapy, with our clients. And endings can be tricky. They really can. And you only need to look to the BACP complaints, and you're not going to need to look too far before you find a complaint that is surrounding an ending, where maybe a client feels that they were abandoned, or a situation where a client might feel that the therapy stretched on further than they needed it to. So endings can be tricky, and it's something that we certainly need to be focusing on, because endings are part of our skills. The endings that we're going to be approaching with our clients are going to take place right there in the therapy room. It's going to be brought up either by the client or by ourselves, and we're going to be working on it. And I find it really interesting that if you look to your studies and all the years of study you might do to become a counsellor, not a huge amount of time is put on endings. Not a huge amount of focus is put on endings. Yet, with every single client you have or are likely to have, you are going to have an ending. Every time that you go in and you do a simulated skill session, at the end of that skill session, there is an ending of that very skills session. So I think it's really important to look at this, I think, in a little more depth. So why do we see this resistance, I guess, to endings with us as human beings? Because I guess an ending infers in some way that there's going to be a change. Maybe that change is that the client is no longer going to be coming and seeing you and have that support. And we're resistant. We're naturally resistant to change. The other side of this is that as human beings, we have a tendency to seek to avoid loss. And it's interesting when you look to psychological studies that we are more motivated by the fear of loss than we are by the reward of gain. It is a massive factor, and it's kind of hardwired into the human condition. It is who we are. And fear of loss, resistance to change, all key into the endings. One of the dangers of ignoring an ending within a therapeutic relationship is that we can create dependence where the client becomes dependent on our therapeutic meeting place, on the counselling, on you as the counsellor for them to feel okay. And we can look for signs in clients where they say things like, you know what, I wouldn't be able to manage in life if it wasn't for you. Because it's very, I guess, disempowering for that client that instead of the counselling process being an empowering journey for them, that they're putting the client is putting the power onto you, projecting that power onto you, and seeing you as being their lifeline, their anchor, their support, the reason that they are able to function in the world, where counselling, as far as I understand it, is about empowering the client to be able to do that for themselves and to be self-sufficient. So we need to look at dependence. And I guess I know from speaking with some of my learners, sometimes you may be in a session and you feel that the therapeutic work is done. That the client said that they wanted to get out of counselling when they first came into your rooms, they have got. You can clearly feel that goal has been met, yet they continue to come back. And sometimes as the counsellor, it's difficult to kind of know how to slot the ending in, how to mention the ending, how to put it in front of the client. And sometimes if we do kind of dare to put that ending in, the client can seem surprised and almost taken aback by the fact that we should mention an ending. And I guess endings are more about a process. It's the process of an ending. It's not a sudden stop. It's not just something that suddenly happens one day, an ending. It is a process. And I love how Irvin Yalom puts it, where Irvin Yalom says, termination is more than an act signifying the end of therapy. It is an integral part of the process of therapy, and if properly understood and managed, may be an important factor in the instigation of change. So there you go. There's a lovely saying that you may be able to quote in an assignment if you're asked to explain endings over there. So what we're hearing here is that an ending is not just suddenly stopping. It is a process. It is something that we would acknowledge when we first see it and when we first feel it is appropriate, or it may be that the client acknowledges it and brings it into the relationship first. It is something that is seen. It is something that is mutually recognized, however scary that may feel at the time, because we already know we have that resistance to change, the risk of the loss that we need to manage there as well. And for some clients, endings are seen as traumatic for their self-concept. Think of early separation. Early separation causes great anxiety that can be taken on into life. And it can affect the way that we act and interact with other people. So we need to be really respectful and recognize endings as a process. So maybe we should look at some stages of planned endings. And I'm going to cover 3 stages of a planned ending. And I think it's important just to put in here that this is not a blueprint that you can take and just print out across all clients, because this is going to be very dependent on that idiosyncratic relationship that you share with the client. It's going to be according to client needs. So one size here certainly doesn't fit all. The first thing that we need to be mindful for is we need to be assessing the client's readiness for an ending. So what do I mean by assessing the client's readiness? How do we know? What are we looking for here? Well, if a client has come in and they've presented with certain requirements, saying, I want to be like this, I'm trying to get here, they kind of bring the goals of what it is that they're looking to get out of therapy. When we see, as a counsellor, that they have reached that place, maybe it's a time to assess the client's readiness for an ending. And of course, again, this is going to be so dependent on the relationship. It's going to be dependent on new material not having surfaced that has a lot of weight that we feel needs dealing with. So let's have a look at an example of how you can introduce that into the therapeutic relationship. A client has just mentioned, wow, when I came in here, I was really struggling with such and such, and I really feel that it's a lot easier for me to cope with that now. That is a great invitation. And again, assessing the readiness of this client, we might say, I hear what you're saying. When you came in here, you were looking to do X, Y, Z. And now here you are telling me that you're finding that you're able to cope with X, Y, and Z. And I just can't help but feel that we may be approaching the end of our time together. Notice that I put a pause in there. And that pause is kind of to put that idea out to the client. It's not that you're ending the session there. It's not that you're saying, that's it, we're done here. This is the last time we're going to be seeing each other. We are now approaching the end of our time together, inferring that there is an approach, inferring that there is a process moving towards that ending. In the same way as I guess that autumn is a sign that winter is coming, we have signs that we can look for in the therapeutic relationship that will indicate the ending. But it's not that when we see that the ending happens, there is that process. And there's comfort for the client in us pointing that out, in outlining that. And of course, in putting that out, we can gauge what the client comes back with, and then we're able to work with that. If the client comes back and goes, oh, no, I don't want this to end. I really value what we have here. You can then work with that. You can work with that in a way of saying, and I hear exactly what you're saying, and what I'm not doing here is in any way saying that we are ending. I just noticed that you came into counselling for, you're now feeling you've got, and I'm just acknowledging that we may just be approaching the end of our time together. But of course, these are your sessions. The ending is not mine to bring. It is yours to bring when you feel ready. So again, that's, I guess, very person-centered, very client-centered. You're giving that back to the client for them to make the decision on that. But you, as the counsellor, have a responsibility to acknowledge that ending when you see it. That's about congruence, and that's about not creating dependence on that client within the counselling relationship. So let's move on to the next stage of the planned ending. We now, after assessing the client's readiness, we're going to move on and we're going to seek closure of the presenting issue, which is kind of covered in that first point anyway. But here, this is important. We're going to acknowledge the power of the relationship, because here's the thing. The client's not just ending their therapy. They're actually ending a relationship that they have with you, the counsellor. And relationships are very special places to be, and they can be mutually beneficial. It may even be that you value the relationship with this client. So it's not just merely therapy coming to an end, that process that you do within that room. A therapeutic relationship has built up. Quite possibly this person has shared information with you, the counsellor, that they've never shared with another living human being. They felt so safe. The relationship has been at such depth. It's like a breakup. It's like a breakup of a very valued relationship. And we have to acknowledge that as part of the ending process, both for ourselves and for the client, that it's not just, okay, that's the end of therapy, we're going to turn that off now. We have a relationship, the relational part of the relationship that we need to deal with as well. And then the third stage in the planned ending is to empower the client, increase self-resilience. And this is obviously linked right into the self-belief of the client. We need to be working with them within the ending. Once we've acknowledged that ending, maybe we've had some kind of an agreement with the client where they're saying, actually, maybe you're right. Linked into that third stage of empowering the client, increasing that self-resilience, linked into the client's self-belief, I have a little story that I'd like to share with you. It's not mine, but I don't recall where it came up from, but I'm very grateful for it. And I use it in sessions from time to time where it feels appropriate. And let me share it with you now. So let's, just for this moment, imagine that we are in a therapeutic relationship together. And I say to you, I recognize what you've just said, that it's feeling so much better for you now. You're feeling so much lighter. Life just seems so much better for you as we are at this moment. And I can't help but kind of acknowledge that when you came in to see me that first time, this is exactly what you were looking for. And it may well be that we're in that process to working towards our last session together, that we might be approaching an ending. I leave a pause and I allow the client to reflect, and I look at their body language and I see what they come back with. And here's where the story sometimes is appropriate. Sometimes going into counselling is like a leaf that is on really choppy water, on white water. It's all whooshing and swooshing and it's turbulent and it's very unpleasant and you're tumbling around and you just can't find yourself. And it may be that through the counselling you find that the water has eased off a little bit and that it's calmer and that now you're kind of bobbing and just floating along and you're going down that stream. And this doesn't mean that you're never going to face rapid water again. It doesn't mean that there won't be rocks around the corner, because that is the nature of life. And of course, if ever you do find yourself in that tumble of life again and you feel you want to reach out, of course you know exactly where I am, and I would welcome that call. That is appropriate for me. I'm in private practice, so I'm able to do that. That may be trickier if you're working in an agency where you have a set amount of sessions that you need to give to the client. You only may give that amount of sessions. It may not be that easy for them to re-engage. But if that does feel appropriate, I've found that that really resonates with some clients, and it is a beautiful story and I guess a pictorial way of showing an ending. And an ending doesn't mean never again. It just means that it is the ending for now. And it's kind of an acknowledgement that life does go on after that ending. So I guess just coming down to it, best practice is not to end at the first mention of endings. Of course, this changes when it's the client that brings the ending in. If the client is to say, you know what, I think I've got everything I need out of this and I'm on my merry way now, thank you very much, it is their right to do that. So let's have a look at the different kinds of endings that we might face. And you may find some in here that you didn't think of. How about a holiday or a break? For the client may be going on a holiday, maybe going on a break. They may be in a really vulnerable place. It is an ending of your sessions for a period of time. How do you work with the client for them to be able to manage and feel safe during that time? How about if you are going on a holiday or a break? When do you introduce that to your client? How do you manage that within your therapeutic relationship? And best practice here is, as soon as you know that you're having a break or a holiday, introduce that to your client. The longer that you have been seeing your client, in theory, the longer the lead time you should give, saying, hey, I'm going, just to let you know, I won't be here in 2 months' time. Not inferring that you might still be coming in 2 months' time, but I just feel respectful to let you know that in 2 months' time, between this date and this date, I'm not going to be here. And I wonder how we might manage while I'm away and how you might feel during that time, and kind of give that over to them. And you can work on that in therapy. So then we have the planned ending. It's almost like the fairy tale ending. And I guess when we do look at endings in our learning environments as student counselors, we look at the ending and exactly how it should be. What is best practice for the ending? But what about unplanned endings? What about when the client just doesn't come back? How does that feel for you as the counsellor? You have a relationship that you've formed. You don't know what's happened. You don't know why they haven't come back. How do you manage that personally? Of course, we have supervision. You may have other ways, process diary. But it's an ending, and we need to acknowledge it because we're talking about endings today. What about the ending of a session? Every single time you start a session with a client, it's going to have an ending. And you're going to find that there are certain clients that, even though you do the contracting, you outline how much time you have, and you mention, just to let you know, we have 5 minutes left, which again is acknowledging the ending, isn't it? It's kind of, it's starting the process of the ending in a session per session basis. But what about that client that kind of, as you say that, just continues, and you're right there and it's 30 seconds to go? How does that feel for you? What does it bring up for you? And how do you manage that kind of an ending with your client? So in closing, let's have a look at what we might see as indicators of endings from our clients. Well, verbal indication from the client. Very plain, simple, easy to understand. I've got what I needed. Thank you very much. The counselling relationship may become less therapeutic, more chatty. This is a sign that potentially you're working towards an ending. And of course, you can't take that in isolation. You can have heavy sessions and then quite a light chatty session and then back into heavy sessions again, and it may be where the client is. But if you're seeing a pattern of the client coming in almost for a sit down, a chat and a cup of tea, that may be a sign that you're approaching an ending. An interesting one is clients arriving late and missing appointments. Why? Because the counselling is less important to them if they are, and again, I just need to put in here, this needs to be taken on a case-by-case basis, and you need to understand what is motivating that. It may be that they have difficulties in getting to you, in which case, of course, this is not an indication of an ending. But if they are able to get to you and they just start arriving late, missing an appointment, oh, I totally forgot about it, it's a clear indicator that the counselling is maybe not as important to them at that time as when they first engage. And it may well be a sign of an ending, definitely something for you to consider. How about joking and intellectualizing within the counselling relationship? Joking and intellectualizing don't feel like words that fit within a counselling relationship at relational depth. Maybe the relational depth is not there anymore, and maybe it is a sign that you're approaching the ending of your time together. And of course, that word dependence, being mindful of dependence, looking out for dependence, making sure that we're empowering the client to stand on their own 2 feet, to be their own person, to trust in themselves. And one final thought on endings. If you bring an ending into the therapeutic relationship, you see something, you see a sign, you've seen one of those indicators, and you introduce it, and the client is devastated by that. Be mindful to work on the reconstruction of the therapeutic relationship. It can almost feel like a shattering of the therapeutic relationship when that is brought in. Hasn't happened in my experience a lot, but it can happen, and you may misread it because we are only human. If you do bring it in and it does feel like devastation, like a bomb going off within your counselling relationship, have a think at how you might repair the fractures, how you might put that back together again, and I guess continue as you were with the client. And of course, there is the ending that you have no control of, where a client only has a set number of sessions. This is, of course, acknowledged and outlined to the client right from your very first session, where you will say in your contracting, we only have 6 sessions together. But if you are on session 5 and this client is still carrying really heavy material, what is it that you can do? You're now approaching an ending. It doesn't feel like a respectful ending for this client. You have no choice because your agency will only allow this a number of sessions. What is it you can do? Can you negotiate more sessions? Is that appropriate in this instance? Can you maybe refer this client onto somebody else who may be able to offer more sessions? If they're bringing in long time work, historic abuse, 6 sessions is unlikely to be enough time for that client. The end.
Well, on hearing that, it just reminds me, it's just so important to have a good ethical ending. And not only that, for the client to really understand there is an ending, because sometimes, you know, clients may be in a place where they're not hearing that. And as I say, being sure how you plan your endings is so important, because it is the source of some of the biggest complaints made to the BACP.
100%. And, you know, we're moving now on to Ask Ken and Rory. It's where we take one of your questions that you may have asked in our Facebook group. And if you're not a member of the Facebook group, just jump on Facebook and put in Counselling Tutor. We're right there at the top, and knock on the door. We're going to let you in the group and you can ask your questions. But Rory, you're going to like today because the question involves a cup of tea, Rory.
Oh, fantastic. In fact, I'll just have another cup of tea on the strength of that. Hang on a second.
And as you sip merrily on your tea there, Rory, I'm going to refer to the Facebook group. Here's the question. It comes in from Claire Weil, and she's asking about ethics and culture, really. She's saying, when are ethics more important? Where is culture more important? She even says here, when can you break the rules, Rory? And she refers to a cup of tea. And what she's really saying there is that there are certain counsellors who say, oh, you can't give a client a cup of tea because they may spill the tea and they may burn themselves. So there's the gist of the topic. So we're going to look at culture versus ethics.
Absolutely. And the tea debate. Well, I have to say, it's unsurprisingly, if you ask me, should you offer a client a cup of tea? The answer is if you have the availability to do so, and if you want to, then why not? The only things I would say is there are some times where we have to take quite a lot of thought, certainly over safety. If you've got a client who's volatile, maybe, who has outbursts of anger, what you don't want is someone who's angry holding a hot cup of liquid, or a hot cup at all. So you might have to think about that. I remember when I worked for an organisation, we had a whole hour dedicated to why we should offer or not offer our clients a cup of tea. And we got into some deep psychodynamic theory around clients hiding behind the cup. I did ask how big the cup we were offering was, if people could actually physically hide behind it. That didn't go down too well. And also lots of debates and about client dependency and things like this. Here's my take on it. I'm a fairly simple northern lad. Tea is in our culture. It's in. Well, I'll rephrase that. It's in a lot of people's culture, and I've met with people from very diverse backgrounds. But one of the things that seems to unite people is a warm drink. It's just one of those things. And I think if you offer someone a cup of tea, it's an offering. It's a peace offering. It's a welcome offering. It breaks down barriers. It does things that are unsaid about how you are as a person. And I understand that my colleagues in the psychoanalytical world may have a different take on it, because they may say subconsciously people are hiding, or they're gulping down their feelings. And I accept that there are some psychodynamic elements, but as a person-centered therapist, luckily I don't have to worry about that, because I'm not a psychodynamic therapist. What's your take on the great debate?
You see, this is a really important topic, and I'm sure you're all scribbling down notes as we talk about tea and therapy here. But me in my practice, Rory, I offer my clients a selection of teas. Actually, they can even have a herbal tea should they choose it, because again, person-centered. But I think that's a great way of going into maybe a deeper topic, which is going to have more meaning to you listening to this, and that is the question of ethics versus culture. Very often you leave your studies and you find yourself working in an agency where they have certain rules and regulations. It's almost a cultural agreement that goes on within the agencies, and you may find that certain things are disagreeable to you, that certain things that are done in the agency that are considered okay jar against your ethical standing as a practitioner. And this is where, I guess, culture, the research shows, often trumps ethics. Is that correct, Rory?
Absolutely. If you get a group of people who are doing the wrong thing on a consistent basis, then it is very, very easy for someone to get sucked in, because the culture is the norm, isn't it?
Yep.
If we think of the word culture in terms of work practice, it's the norm. This is what we do. We go into the office every day, and this is what we do every day, and then we go home. These are the normal things we do. And if that normality is unethical, then what can happen is that people get into all sorts of trouble. So yes, culture can trump ethics. And sometimes, one of the things that I know I teach my students, and it's a mantra that I have myself, is don't be afraid to be unpopular.
100%.
Because sometimes you have to be the voice that goes, no, that's not right, and not just say that's not right, but these are the reasons. Give solid reasons. And usually, sometimes people kind of forget what they've learnt, or there's so much pressure to produce results that they kind of bypass things. And it's at those times we're in the most dangerous therapists, not just us, our clients as well.
100%. And, it's ethics that guide us, and that's why we have ethical bodies, ethical umbrellas, ethical frameworks to which we work as practitioners. And here's the thing, and I've said this a number of times before, and you know what, I'm going to keep on saying this. It's your practice. The fact that you may be working in an agency doesn't make what you do the agency's practice. It is your practice, and you have to be true to your ethical roots. Get your ethical framework, look through that, and if something's happening within an agency which jars with your ethics, you need to question that. It gives you, I guess, a dilemma. Rory, you got a great tool when facing an ethical dilemma. You use Tim Bond's ethical problem-solving matrix, and that is an amazing document. I wonder if we shouldn't make that available as a download for this episode.
Well, maybe, or maybe we make it for another podcast. Maybe we could do a podcast on dealing with ethics.
Oh, I like what you're doing. He's putting the hook. He's putting the bait on the hook there, everyone. You're gonna be looking forward to that, because it is really a fantastic document. But it's about you sitting down, looking at that culture. It's very easy to just follow because it's the path of least resistance, the culture of an agency. But if it is compromising your ethical standards, stop and think carefully. Is this the way that you wish to manage your practice?
Absolutely. And, it does happen. And if you're in any doubt, the final word goes with your ethical body. So your supervisory ethical body. And if there's a debate, and there should be debates, a healthy organisation should be one that has debates and discusses about their policies and procedures on a regular basis. And if there's something that you're not happy about, give the BACP a ring. Get a view from them, because ultimately they're the custodians of the ethical framework.
100%. And there are going to be times when you need to exercise courage, and the ethical framework calls upon us to aim to aspire, I guess, to show courage in what we do. And courage means sometimes swimming against the tide, and saying it as it is. And it may well be that when you say it as it is within an agency, that they then say, well, you know what, if that's the way you want to be, then you can't work here anymore. But holding on to your ethics is so, so important, and having the courage to do so, because without courage, Rory,
you cannot practice any other virtue with consistency.
Maya Angelou, is it?
Yes, she's from a book. I know why the caged bird sings. We'll stick a link in the show notes to that. But it's very true, and sometimes you have to practice courage, and courage is done like exercising any muscle. You do it a little bit until your courage muscle builds up. And the other thing is, just because an agency or the people you work with are not doing it ethically doesn't mean that they're actually being bad people. It may be that they don't know. And I think there's something about having, if you're coming out of your training or you're in the midst of your training as a student, you should be being taught the very latest, very best practice. And I know the practice I teach, which is I don't know, 15 years, I think, since I qualified, something like that. It's completely different to what I was taught, in the 2000s, because we've all moved on. Everything's moved on. Therapy's moved on. The way it's approached has moved on. The law's moved on. We've got the Equality Act that came in 2010. That didn't exist when I started. Data Protection Act barely existed. CRBs, I can remember no one having a CRB when I started, or a disclosed the barring DBS check. And it'd been quite a novelty. Everybody sat there saying, what's a CRB? It was at the time. So, your agency should be open to having someone who's being taught the latest techniques. And in fact, a few years ago, I was teaching a group of learners who went to a practice, and they were not very happy with the contract the practice was given to the client. And I said, well, what are you going to do about it? And he said, well, us. And I said, well, yeah, it's your practice, isn't it? What are you going to do? And they went off and they got a meeting together, and they said, well, we're not happy with this, we're not happy with that, and these are the reasons why. And it was quite interesting. What the students expected was the agency to say, this is what we do, you take it or leave it. What actually happened was the agency said, we have no idea. We didn't know this.
Yes.
Thank you so much for bringing it to us. And they rewrote the students. I was incredibly proud of them, Ken. The students rewrote the contract. They let me have a look at it. I had a look at it and said, yeah, that looks great. Sent it back, and that's the contract I believe they're using still a few years on.
And there you go. There is a demonstration of courage, and what that resulted in an agency changing their culture, I guess, the way that they were doing things. And I'll leave you with one real life example from my own practice. I have referrals from time to time from a certain agency into my own private practice, and one of the requirements was that a report is written on the clients that they refer to me, and that report is passed on to them at the end of therapy, so they can evidence that they came into therapy and that there was some kind of movement. And one of the clients that they referred through to me, when I was contracting with them, said, "No, I don't want what I discuss with you to be shared with anybody else. I don't want you handing over that information to the agency." And I went back to the agency because it is my ethical standpoint to hold the confidentiality of the client. It's the cornerstone of what we offer. And I went back to the agency and I said, I'm not able to pass you through the report that you're asking for on this client because the client doesn't want their information shared. And the agency said, "Well, if that's the way that you want to work it, then we won't be referring clients to you from now on. You've got this client, you can work with them, and that's fine, but we won't be referring clients to you from now on." And I said, "Thank you very much. It's been great working with you."
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well done, Ken.
Episode 10 of the Counselling Tutor podcast. Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you for listening. Thank you for your comments on the Facebook page. Thank you very much for your reviews on iTunes. We can't thank you enough for those. And last time I looked, I think we had 34 5-star reviews. Woohoo! And we got to number 1 in the world, the number 1 podcast in the world under the higher education, what is it? Section. Yeah, I can't think.
Yes.
Too much coffee in iTunes. And that's all thanks to you, our listeners. So grateful.
Well, it's absolutely fantastic. I don't know about you, Ken, but I'm going to stay grounded and stay safe and get myself another cup of tea.
Take care.
Thank you for listening to the Counselling Tutor podcast. Find the show notes for this episode on our website at www.counsellingtutor.com.